Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. Our guest today is Ian Skully. He recently completed a film series entitled Legacy, Austria's Influence on American Skiing. Good morning, Ian.
Good morning. Good to be here.
So you're in the area doing a bit more research on the Austrian influence on JP.
Yes, because it was substantial, although it wasn't covered in my film series, and in some ways I wish it was, but I couldn't really cover, at the same time I couldn't necessarily cover everybody in film, because film, just as you, I know you're a well-known writer in the area, you can capture a lot more, you can record maybe, should we say,
Right.
a lot more in the written word than you can necessarily in a film, because the film can't go on
Right.
500, in other words, an hour film is, I don't know how many pages that would be in a book, but in a book you can cover a lot more. So I think that the influence of the Austrians here was substantial too, and is worth noting and worth maybe researching and bringing to light too.
Well, we were talking beforehand about a couple of the Austrians who were involved with JP, including Walter Foger, who is now deceased, and Hubert Dabera. What have you learned about Walter?
What have I learned about Walter? I'd say that Walter really, the fact that he's in the U.S. Ski Hall of Fame shows that he did contribute substantially to skiing in America, and in particular, he left his mark, I think, mainly here in Vermont, and in particular this area, that the Northern Kingdom here. And I would say that Walter, as we were discussing before we came on air, when he came to Vermont, and in particular this area, the vision of the people that wanted a ski area here at J was one thing. It seemed that they wanted to have like a local ski area. Skiing was kind of booming across the country after World War II, and but Walter came from Austria, and skiing is a national pastime there. And skiing, if you ever get a chance to ski in Austria, the skiers are huge, because they go from, for instance, here, I don't know exactly all the topography here and all the towns, but it would be as though you would go up Jay Peak,
Right.
and then you would ski down and go down to another town, and then in some cases then go up on some lifts to another mountain, and then ski down another stone. So that's the context from which he came, and he actually came from one of the very first and most noted ski areas in the world, and that's in Kitzbühel in Austria. It's also where some of the first ski schools were developed and ski resorts. So he came with that background, that mentality, and where everybody skied, and tourism was a big part of life there. And so I think, well, as he mentions in this book, that he had an autobiography which he wrote, Through Heaven and Hell on Skis. And I think it was, as he mentions in the book, it was sort of a shock when he came here to see that. I think he came with that mentality, and then what he found. So he then had big visions, big dreams of what to do.
So what did he find when he came here?
What did he find? Should I maybe read
read an excerpt from it.
Okay.
Because from a person who has been recording the history of Jay myself, but just through my writing and through my interviewing, Walter was not a man who was at a loss for words. You would probably agree with that from what you've heard.
Yeah.
So read a portion.
Well, here he talks about he had just arrived in the United States. He had been recruited. My understanding was that he was recruited, and at the time, both just before World War II and after World War II, there wasn't that much ski know-how here. So they were looking to, people who were starting resorts were looking to recruit. And of course it makes sense. Well, where's the know-how? And Austria was one of those places. And the Austrians had a real need to come, because either for political reasons before the war, or real economic reasons after World War II. So Walter was one of those people that jumped at the opportunity. And when he first came to New York City, and then he took a flight up to Burlington, and then he thought he was already all the way there, but then he kept going and going, and he arrived the next day, and he's like, "Where's the mountain?" In any case, he finally got up to the mountain. When this is where he comments, one day later, the president, who I think at that time was it Harvey?
That would have been That would have been, you know what? It escapes me at the moment.
Well, I think it's the man we were talking about. In any case, the president at the time, he said, one day later, the president agreed to drive me up to the ski area. Not in my wildest dreams had I expected what I saw. There, at the foot of the mountain, stood a half-finished barrack, nearby a shack, which obviously was to serve as a ticket booth, and further away, what he considered an ugly-looking poma lift without a cable. The whole ski area consisted of one slope, cut out from the woods, halfway up one of the 3 existing mountains. Everything was too close to the steep slope. What a disappointment. Not one trail existed. I don't know if that necessarily was the case, but for him, this, once again, you have to see within the context from where he was coming from. But, however, he noticed, and says here, but there was something else. As I stood in the parking lot looking around me, I saw over the trees, high in the sky, and gleaming at me, a majestic peak with long, steep flanks. It was a wonderful winter day, obviously imprinted on his mind. I'll just finish here. A deep blue sky waited over the massive mountain, whose sharp horizon seemed to pierce the blue. The trees sang the melody of a proud future. The peak lured me on and whispered to me, come and conquer me. At that moment, I forgot the miserable sight around me. My heart was inflamed with the beauty of that peak, and I decided to stay. I felt I was needed.
Well, that's, he was such a great writer. He was also a painter, and my brain cells have kicked in, and the president at the time was Don McNally.
Oh, that's right, yes.
Don McNally, he too was an interesting man. Don McNally he grew up on the vaudeville circuit. He was a performer, even all of his life to some degree, and he also owned 2 of the wildly popular drive-in theaters in the area. And but to get off a bit is the reason he quit J. Peaker eventually was not because of a major disagreement. It would be what we would view as a minor disagreement. He quit because...
Well, you're not talking about he being Walter?
No,
Or Mr. McNally?
Mr. McNally is because they agreed to paint the lift towers yellow. Mr. McNally had a phobia of yellow because when he was on the vaudeville circuit, they had a tent burn. So he disagreed with Walter and crew. He said, if you paint those towers yellow, that's bad luck and I'm leaving. And they painted them yellow and he left. So there's a little side note. So Walter stayed here until like 1967. And do you think
he came in 1956 and then left in 1967?
And I think it's safe to say that he had a major influence on that mountain.
Yeah, during his time here, I think he had somewhat of an engineering background and he was sort of mechanically oriented too, which served him very well here in the context of building up a ski area, because he got very involved even into the details of helping to build the lifts. He also had from his background in skiing and knowledge of terrain and equipment, he used all of that sort of engineering type mindset, which not necessarily all the Austrians had, and really helped build the ski area with his hands too. And that's very clear through his autobiography. So he helped put up the lifts, but he also was very much of a traveling salesman. He said, if they don't come to the mountain, and how are they going to come to the mountain? They don't know about it. Right. I have to go out and sell the mountain to them. And so he was all out and about all over the place, and so he wasn't always at the mountain. In fact, he was marketing the mountain too. So he was kind of a man wearing many hats, a jack of all trades, and he put that all to use. And then on top of that, he tried to bring in a new technique where you learn to ski in a week with shorter skis and all that. But something that's not noted in this book, and something that I do know from doing some other research, is he came from, once again, Kitzbühel plays a role here. Karl Köhler was the head of the ski school in Kitzbühel, and Karl Köhler was known as the father of the GLM method, which was the graduated length method, which is, in other words, put people on really short skis and teach them in a short time. And from what I can see and tell, the Natur technique that he was trying to promote here at J. Peak was really maybe a stepchild of that.
Right.
Of what Karl Kerler was doing in Kitzbühel. He doesn't really mention that in here, but I think what was going on in Kitzbühel, once again, that's where he was from, was influencing what he was trying to do here.
And you know, another thing is interesting, though. He came here and did so much so quick, but when he came here, he could speak very little English. That's how come the founders of the ski area, tried to find somebody who could speak with him, and help him translate. And it was Alice Lewis, not originally, but she had lived in Derby, and she helped translate. And because everybody has humorous stories about how he would get his words, he would say the darndest things because he would kind of massacre the English language, and so he was a mover and a shaker, but he had to conquer the language barrier first.
Well, I mean, he must have made for, in many cases, sort of a caricature, somewhat a shorter guy, I guess somewhat bow-legged,
right.
and I think he had a very strong accent.
Right.
And once again, very typical of, although he was well-schooled, I think he also was a real mountain boy. So, just like in all rural areas, there's strong accents. There's strong accents around here, too.
Right. That's what I've been told.
That's right. And so, in any case, he carried a very strong accent with him, so he must have really stuck out. And in some cases, probably created interest, and I think in some cases, it also, you have to think, you put it in the context of the time, and he had fought on the German side.
Right.
He wasn't necessarily a political refugee from Austria. Right. He was an economic refugee. Right. And that's very different. So I can imagine there was just the fact of him being here made him a lightning rod. If you know that context too. He'd also been a soldier too.
Right. Right. And the interesting thing, he was also joined by his fellow Austrian, Hubert Dabra, and Hubert Dabra was the first full-time certified ski instructor at Jay before he started up the Carinthia Inn and then later Alpine Haven. But in talking to a lot of the early pioneers who worked side by side, including Andy Pepin of Newport is the last surviving member of the original board of directors. His brother was killed in World War II. He served in World War II, but he said for them, they put that battle behind them to work for the benefit of the mountain. And he said that there were some people who tried to make the fact that Walter and Hubert had fought against them. But they said for the most part, everybody put that aside and they worked for the betterment of the area.
But I think also maybe one of the things that eased that is once again, you look into the historical context of the time. Why were the Austrians, why were they coming here? First, to a degree, they were needed for the know-how, mm-hmm. but they were also, they were probably, in a sense, welcome to, because at that time, the American economy, the American way of life was sort of taking over mm-hmm. and was, in a sense, booming. And I think when their good times are going, when the economic good mm-hmm. times, those type of things tend to mm-hmm. naturally recede anyways. But mm-hmm. it's usually when the really tough times come about, that it's more likely that people turn on each other too.
Right. Now let's go back a little bit. You are Austrian by heritage?
Yes, and in fact, German is my mother tongue. My mother's from Austria, and she, to a degree, was also, she's from the same generation as Walter Foger, and when I came across this book, I actually gave it to her, and she found it fascinating because she's a contemporary of Walter. She wasn't necessarily a skier, but she also left Austria after the war because there really wasn't much future, and came to the United States in the Austrian Foreign Service and met my father and stayed. And as you mentioned, a lot of the Austrians, Swiss, Austrian, and Bavarian people felt very at home that came to mm-hmm. The Vermont area. In particular, I have a Steireranzug. And this is what we wear when we get together as a family, and that's the eastern part of Austria, but that's looks very similar to Vermont and New Hampshire. So my mother felt very comfortable when my parents were lucky enough to be able to get a second home. My father having grown up in the Boston area, but having skied in North Conway mm-hmm. and in Stowe and that, And they looked around, and Franconia felt like home to her. And so that I was lucky enough, eternally grateful for my parents for giving me the opportunity to grow up in part in that area, and in particular an Austrian ski village, Mittersill. If you've ever been there, it's built just like Hubert's place.
Hubert has more than 80 Austrian-style chalets, for those of you not familiar with Alpine Haven. Now tell me, how did your film series come about, and where has it aired?
The series came about because, once again, that connection with Austria. I went to, we get together as a family, as I mentioned. We have gatherings, and at one of those gatherings, typically it's in the summer, but one time a set of cousins set it up to be a ski gathering, and I said, I want to be there. I was going through my certification process, professional ski instructors. I went over there. After the gathering, I went up to the Adelberg, which is sort of considered in many ways the cradle of alpine ski instruction, and there I met the grandson of Hannes Schneider, who lives who grew up in North Conway, and the connections were made, and then I started seeing that, started understanding that some of these pioneers that had come over were about to pass away. I speak German, I grew up skiing, I know the lingo, became an instructor, so I had something in common with the people I interviewed. I interviewed Herbert Schneider. He started talking about all these other instructors, all these other people, and that's when I realized there seemed to be a pretty big story here. And one thing led to another, and so, like, for instance, you learn about this and that person, and they tell you what about this person or that person, and what about Jay Peak. You know, Jay Peak I had skied maybe once before, but did I have any idea that it had anything to do with, you know, the immigration story that, in a sense, my mom's part of? No, but these stories are interesting. I think they very much follow the immigration story of America. You know, different groups, different people have come for different reasons, and a lot of people know about the Austrian influence on music, but I don't think the ski part of it is documented as well, and that's kind of what I'm doing.
And you had an opportunity to meet Walter, right? And you said he was a man of few words at that moment.
Yeah, well, I met him. He actually moved back to Austria,
right.
And there was a ski history conference over in Austria, and I met him there. And he wasn't really all that well at the time, but I think he seemed to have somewhat of a chip on his shoulder. I think he always felt he was a little bit misunderstood. Why or how, I don't know. I'm sure that's why one of the reasons he wrote this book. But he never really. Actually, this is important to note about him, is he didn't go through the. There was an Austrian school that was on St. Christoph on the Adelberg. On the Adelberg, where most of the top Austrian instructors got their certification through that, and he didn't go through that schooling. Right. So, in a sense, he wasn't part of the official or elite cadre, even though he was successful in his ski life. But so he was always a little bit of an outsider, even to and amongst the other Austrians that were in this country. Right. So he wasn't necessarily buddy with all of the other Austrians, and there were a lot in Vermont, a lot, especially over at Stowe and at Stratton. But he does mention in his book that he was friends with Sepp Bruch, who was the GM for years and years at Stowe.
Now, you've also spoken to Hubert Dabra, who is near 90 and who is in outstanding health, and he interests you not only because of his involvement at Jay itself, but because of his Austrian-style chalets that he built up there, that entire community.
Yeah. Well, what I was trying to document through my series is that skiing, to some people, is a way of life, a whole culture, and that means more than just putting boards on and going down, and it has to do with music, it has to do with fashion, it has to do with après-ski, and it has to do with, in his case, architecture. And a lot of the people in the mountains of Austria grow up when they have schooling and become tradesmen. So I think, I can't speak of this for sure, but I think he definitely had some training in construction, and he brought that all to bear when he came over here, he had a vision of creating an Austrian-style chalet village, and he made it happen. And that's also, I mean, to be admired, but it's also, I was impressed when I saw it, and it looks not all that dissimilar to Mittersill in the Franconia area. And there are actually some other little towns like that that are sort of modeled after a little Austrian village. And actually, I've found out even in Brazil you can go, and there's some towns like that too.
You know, the one thing I think about though is, what would Jay Peak have looked like today if it wasn't for their influence? Because even the founders will say they had an idea what they were doing, but because they weren't firmly entrenched in the ski industry, such as the Austrians, they envisioned more, like we had a lot of ski slopes around here. It wasn't that was going to be the first ski slope, but it was going to be a sizable ski slope. But would it be like it is today if it wasn't for the Austrians? Maybe it would have, but it would have taken a lot longer, because they really envisioned this oversized community ski mountain. It wasn't going to be this. But when the Austrians came, they had years and years of history behind them to draw from, so they kind of knew what they were looking for.
Yeah, but I think you more or less answered the question. But what I'd like to add to that, and which makes me very sad now to see, is I don't know so much about Walter, because I didn't know him. I didn't get to know him personally, but I've met Hubert, and he seems to carry some of that culture with him. I think it's something about trying to maintain and keep an alpine culture, and it's not necessarily sure if you're going to build a skier and it's going to be a business, it needs to make money.
Right.
But that's not the whole object, and that's not the end object. In other words, it's not necessarily in Hubert. Sure, it was a real estate venture, but it was within a cultural context. And I feel that the cultural context, not necessarily that just the Austrians had, I think they shared it with the Vermonters, and the Vermonters gained something from that, and also shared their culture with the Austrians. But I sense and fear that that's really being lost, and that was another reason why I did this, the culture of skiing. Because as the world becomes more and more corporate, it sort of beats out or takes away any of the culture, and what are you left with then?
Right.
And that's kind of a question out there, and that's why I felt it was very important to document this, not just strictly it's not just strictly about athletics, but rather about culture.
Right. Now, that's a good point, because the reason I record history is very similar to yours, is to record it because I see so much disappearing. But but on the other hand, with Jay Peak, I know where you're coming from, because it has changed a lot in recent years. I will say the positive thing is Bill Stinger, who is one of the co-owners, has, while some people try to forget the past and start history from where they began, Bill Stinger has actually embraced the past. He celebrates the past. That's how come he has me writing a history book of it. And so I know everything he does. Even though maybe not everybody agrees with some of the changes, he always has its history and its pioneers in mind when he's trying to move forward.
Well, you mentioned that, and one could have maybe gathered from what I was saying that I was trying to making some commentary about Jay, and actually that's not the case, because I've felt that same. I've gotten that feeling. I don't know Jay that well, but I've been there a couple of times. I've seen what they're building, and I don't get that feeling that it's all being lost there. I really don't. It seems like an area that's trying to keep the best of the past and move forward. You have to move forward, but I also go with the dictum: you don't know where you're going to if you don't know where you're coming from.
Right.
Like where you're coming.
Exactly.
And I get the sense that Jay, for the most part, gets it. Hopefully it won't go too far in one way, but hey, if with especially like a winter like this winter, a water park, if I have my son and we can go to a water park, great. And it's just that if it's done in a tasteful fashion, and it seems to be seems to be being done that way. You know, the architecture's nice, and it doesn't seem to be getting overly built up.
And I think the way they've developed the condos up through there, I think adds quite a bit of tasteful change as well.
Yeah, that's my sense too. But a lot of ski areas, because of the travels that I did to make this documentary film, I've seen some areas that have really been sort of lost their soul.
Right.
And there's really not much there. It's just a big real estate development, and the skiing gets pushed.
Right.
It becomes tertiary, not even secondary.
Right. Well, we're about ready to wrap up, but what more would you like to tell the viewers about what you're doing, or any future projects for that matter?
Yeah, well, you mentioned, I think I failed to mention, so what's become of the series. I think some people have seen the value in the series, and it was recently spotlighted by New Hampshire Public TV. There's a number of Vermont segments in here too. In particular, Stowe was very influential for a long time. So it's being shown through not only in New Hampshire, but now on a national basis. It's been shown in Austria. So it's more or less achieved with, more or less gotten to the point where I hoped it would years ago when I undertook the project. More recently, I'm focusing on agriculture, doing films about agriculture and trying to document as well as promote local agriculture and sort of the revival of agriculture, and that also is a way of life. So my film company is called Culture Films, documenting the breadth and beauty of human culture and agriculture. And so I've been focusing more recently on agriculture, and actually hoping to go across the border today to look at what happens in Quebec too with agricultural life there. And that's really, and my website is pretty easy to find, culturefilms.com.
Do you have hope for the American agricultural industry?
I think the New England area is much brighter than in the big farm areas, but if you really dig into what's going on in agribusiness, we're talking about the corporatization of everything. It's pretty scary. Once you understand what's really going on, and you go in a supermarket, there's not a lot of real food in supermarkets, and I think we just look around and we see the consequences of that, and let alone all the packaging. My wife is from a third world country, and the one pleasure and the best thing that we do whenever we go to our country, Guatemala, is going to the market, and just all the fresh food and all of the and the people you're bartering too when you buy. And that's that was the case here not all that long ago, but our food sources have really degraded, and so I think everybody needs to make a concerted effort to promote and support local farming.
Well, I think it's great what you're doing, because, as I said, is you and I are actually doing very similar things. As I'm recording history and culture in words and in photos and in the interviews I do, but you're doing it through films and interviews, and I'll pat ourselves on the head, because I think what we're doing is very important, because, as you said, if we don't understand our past, as we move forward, that's not a good thing.
I think people are just sort of, I see it all over in the ski industry that the people don't really understand the past, but you just see it out on the ski slope. They'll be trying to teach things, they're saying, wait a second, those things were said years ago, and all these counter things. So it just helps to inform in any walk of life, whatever profession you do, try to understand who came before you and help inform you. And Scott, I'd like to, I think we do share a lot of the same interests and have sort of somewhat similar focuses. But once again, I want to thank you for having me here, because the reason I found out about you and your work is through your journal, which was, and you did a number of years ago, you did a spotlight on Hubert, right. But also my understanding, and I congratulate you, that you're doing some substantial research and work to document the history of Jay, and which of course includes the ski area. So thank you for your time, as I've picked your brain somewhat, and hopefully you can pick something from my brain and be able to put that to use.
This is all, and I thank you for your words, and this is all about people working together. And the one thing I find is the wonders of the internet, whether it's Facebook or websites. we can become connected with people all over the world so we can do this.
Mm-hmm.
So, with those words, I'd like to thank Ian Skully for coming on the show today, and I'd like to thank the viewers for tuning in. Thank you.